So the topic for tonight is chintz. And as you know from this wonderful exhibition, chintz here has come to mean something different to what I'm going to be talking about this evening. So I thought we'd start by defining some terms. So on the screen is the sort of chintz, the Indian chintz, that is the topic of my talk. And I just wanted to say a few words about what the definition of an Indian chintz is, as opposed to the sort of Western printed cotton, usually with floral designs, that has become chintz to many of us in the Western world, probably since about the 1920s, when chintz seemed to take on this definition. What we're looking at here on the screen is a late 17th century, or about 1700, hand-drawn, resist-dyed and mordant-dyed textile from southern India, made for the Western market. And it's basically these characteristics that identify all of the Indian textiles that we'll be looking at tonight. I'll be saying a bit more about those processes a bit later on, but the other thing I'm going to be doing is to really show you some of the design elements that went into these very beautiful textiles, and to say something about how they were used in the West and what their impact was when they got there. So this is one of the earlier pieces. It's from the V&A collection, probably, as I say, late 17th century, and we'll be looking at some more of these historic pieces shortly. I just wanted to show you some of the sort of classic types. As, for example, this one, which has the sort of wonderful flowering tree design that we have in so many of the Indian chintzes that came to the West. Now, these, you can see a lot of similarity in this wonderful sort of sinuous tree with these fanciful, made-up sort of flowers. These were obviously the inspiration for things like the Tree of Life quilt that you have in the exhibit here. These are two pieces from the current show here. And I just wanted to make sure that the difference was clear, that these pieces in this exhibition are made of pieces of fabric printed in the West, either in England or possibly in America. And these were cut up and used on quilts. Now, these fabrics were obviously based very closely on the Indian designs that had originally come from the West, and those are what I'll be showing you shortly. So the tree design really dominated the earlier textiles from India that were sent to the West from around 1600 or the early years of the 17th century onwards. The flowering tree was really one of the most popular throughout the 18th century. This one actually belonged to the actor David Garrick and his wife Eva in London in the 18th century. It's in the V&A. There's a whole set of them that Garrick commissioned from India in about 1770. And because of the prohibition that was put on chintzes at that time, and I'll come back to that later, these were confiscated by the customs when they came into London. And there's a wonderful correspondence from Garrick, who, of course, being an actor, made everything terribly over-dramatic, who more or less pleads for the sanity of himself and his wife to have these chintz hangings released from custody, where they're thrown like common lumber. So poor Garrick, he did finally get his chintzes back and put them around his bed, which we also have in the V&A. So they're still together, but in our museum. Some other countries, especially Holland, liked other sorts of designs. The trees were really very popular in Britain, but the Dutch went for some really sort of big, gutsy designs, like this piece, which is... we have two of this identical design. One of them is quilted and one of them isn't. And I'm not sure whether this is the quilted one or the non-quilted one. But basically these are huge, bigger than anything you have in your exhibition here, I think. They reach from about this ceiling down to the ground. So they are immense, and whether they were meant to go on a bed is uncertain. They might have been used for hanging on a wall where they would have made a very dramatic statement. And quilted chintzes were often used for hanging on walls, as partly because they came into fashion at a time when the heavy woolen tapestries were going out of fashion, and so they were actually used in some houses as a means of warming the place up a bit. So it's not just on beds. The other main area where chintzes were used was later on in dress. And to begin with, some of the garments were actually made from furnishing fabrics which were cut up and tailored. That's why quite often in some of the earlier pieces of dress you get rather an incongruous, large-scale design because it was once a large hanging cut up into dress fabric. Later on in the 18th century, much more refined, sort of rather beautiful, elegant sort of sprig designs became more popular for dress, and we'll see some of those shortly. And it wasn't only women's dress either. Men were also swept up in the craze for chintz, and particular in a type of garment called a banyan, like this. These are wonderful sort of informal robes that people wore at home from the late 17th century onwards. This is the sort of thing Samuel Pepys would have lounged around in the 1660s at his home in England. In Holland, where they were very popular, they were also called Japanese dresses, and in fact it's probably more to Japan than India that the cut owes a debt. It's more like a sort of kimono or something like that than anything an Indian would wear. But it's also part of the very mixed up and hybridized sort of taste for chinoiserie that was so current in Britain from the end of the 17th century onwards. People wore things that they thought were Indian when in fact they were more Japanese. They called Indian embroidery China work. They called India a China shop where all manner of wonderful exotic things could be purchased. So as long as it was Oriental, they really didn't care where it came from, and it was all just a marvellous Asian mixture of things. So the banyan was more or less typical of that trend. Now I just wanted to say a couple of words about the technique that goes into an Indian chintz. And these are 4 stages that was made specially for the V&A in the early 20th century by an Indian craftsman that shows you some of the stages. Now on the top, can I master this device? Yes, on the top left, here we've got the design has been drawn by hand, and this is with a very basic tool called a kalam, which actually just means reed or pen. So it's basically a bamboo tube with a lot of string wrapped around part of its length, which is the reservoir for the sort of ink that is going to be used to draw on the cloth. So very, very basic tool that is still being used today. So with the kalam, this outline has been drawn in iron mordant. So when we sometimes talk about a painted textile, it's not actually the colour that is painted or drawn onto these cloths. It is this thing called the mordant, which is a sort of chemical, a naturally occurring chemical, which causes the dye to be fast, to stay in the textile when it's immersed in the dye. So here the outline has been drawn with iron mordant, and it's then been dyed so that where the mordant has been applied, the black dye will remain. So that stage is stage 1. The next stage is where the red needs to go. So we're still looking at the top left-hand slide, and all the places that are needed to be red are painted or sort of brushed with the bamboo pen with an alum mordant. That's alum from which aluminium is made, but this is the naturally occurring salt from the ground. and this reacts with the red dye to make red. So wherever you want a red colour, you apply alum mordant. You then immerse the cloth in the red dye, which in this particular case is from a plant called chai, C-H-A-Y, which grows only in southeast India, which is why these particular textiles come from a fairly small part of India. So the top left-hand slide shows you what has happened when the cloth has been immersed in the dye, the red dye, and all the excess red dye has been rinsed out, and so wherever it hasn't had the alum mordant applied, it's gone back to its natural colour. Next, on the top right, we see the wax resist applied, partly applied, it's not quite finished. This is sort of put on, again, with any sort of implement, and this, you cover the entire textile except those parts that you want to be blue, because you're going to dye it with indigo. Now, indigo is the opposite of the red dye. It doesn't need a mordant. In fact, it will dye anything it touches. So you want to shield all those places you don't want to be blue. You have to shield it from that dye. So only the blue bits will be exposed to that dye. So here, bottom left, we see it after it's been immersed in the blue dye. The leaves have gone blue. The wax is then boiled off, melted, and gathered up and used again on the next textile. And what we have here now are blue leaves and the red mordanted flowers. And then in the final stage on the bottom right, green is made by overpainting the indigo dyed leaves with a yellow dye, probably turmeric. Now, the problem with yellow dyes is that they're very rarely fast. Unlike the blue and the red, they're not colour fast. They fade in the light, they fade when you wash them. So we see very few old Indian chintzes that still have green leaves. Almost all of the ones that we'll be seeing, their leaves are blue. It's not because they were intended to be blue, it's because the yellow that was overpainted has faded or been washed off. So those are basically the stages that you go through to make an Indian chintz. And what I didn't even mention was the pre-preparation, which involves days of bleaching the cloth in a vat of sheep dung, lots and lots of rinsing, lots of drying. So all this is quite a long, drawn-out process and could take many weeks. But basically, you can see that this is a very different idea than just printing a fabric with a design. Now, why did they bother to do this? I just thought I'd show you a couple of details of chintzes where you can really see, for example, how a white resist can be used to great effect to make incredibly fine white designs against a coloured ground. So these little patterns here and these here, these sort of infilling designs in white against the coloured flower, these are made again by drawing with wax, with this culum, this bamboo culum. So everywhere you don't want coloured, you draw in wax, then you dye it, and everywhere that your wax has been, you can boil that off and you get a beautiful white design against the coloured background. So that's one of the sort of major characteristics of an Indian chintz, that you get these marvellous white patterns against coloured ground. Now, very occasionally, you do get some printed elements in Indian chintzes. Now, these details are taken from the piece on the top right. It's a large palampore or hanging bed cover. They were often used for both hangings or bed covers. And the word palampore, I should mention, is one that you quite often come across when reading about Indian chintzes. It's basically an anglicisation of a Persian word, palang posh, which means bed cover. And that just became the normal sort of Indian English name for these large imported hangings. But if you look at the detail on the left, this one, you can see that this, or perhaps you can't see, but I can assure you it is the case, that this sort of cluster of leaves which sort of comes out of the side of the tree is in fact a printed element. For some reason, this area of the design was carved out of a block and printed, and the same goes for these little creatures, these little squirrel-like creatures, which appear in pairs here and there throughout this particular textile. But that's the only time I've ever seen an Indian chintz that has printed matter in the design. Sometimes we see printing in the border, in the border or the background. In these two, again, I hope you can see, it's rather subtly coloured, but there's a sort of fern-like background to this one, which is actually done by block printing, and the same applies to the vermiculated or sort of worm-like background in the one on the bottom. So sometimes when there's a large area to be covered with a particular sort of design, you may find it printed, but it's very, very unusual. Now, where did all this sort of come from? Obviously, we're talking about the pieces that were exported to Britain and Holland from the 17th century onwards. But these things had a life before the Europeans came along and started wanting them for themselves. And this is the type of hanging that was being made in the same technique, but as you can see, in completely different designs, for use in India itself. This is a hanging that would have been used in a temple in order to tell the story of the Ramayana, the great Hindu epic. This one's probably a canopy because, as you can see, some of the design would be upside down if you hung it on the wall, so it's almost certainly made to be looked at from underneath, just as a lot of the wall paintings telling the same stories in Indian temples, you get them both in rows on the wall, but you also get them on the ceilings of temples. So this is made in exactly the same technique with mordant dyeing and resist dyeing and hand-drawn outlines. So although they're the same techniques, the sort of designs were so completely different because they weren't being made for an external market. They were being made for domestic use. Now, some of the earliest exported pieces from India were not from this southeastern part of India done in that chintz technique. They were from northwestern India, from Gujarat, and they were block printed. So just very briefly to show you what was going on in other parts of India early on, these are two block printed pieces that were exported to the Middle East, and they were found in Egypt. Now these probably date from about the 15th century. Some of these finds have been carbon dated, and some date to as early as the 10th century and some to as late as the 17th. So it's a sort of medieval period. Now these, although they're block printed, they're still making use of that resist dyeing and mordant dyeing. Wherever you have indigo, basically, you have to have resist dyeing. Like the piece on the right, you can see very clearly that the white designs are done by a wax resist. And again, the reddish colour would have been done with an alum mordant, only in this case it's a different plant. This is related to the madder plant, not that wonderful, brilliant, slightly pinkish red that you get in the South Indian chintzes. So as well as the Middle East, Mediterranean area, printed textiles from northwest India, from Gujarat, were sent to Asia. There were several markets in parts of Asia that India had been supplying for centuries, and we don't know how long. But certainly from the very early centuries AD, Indian textiles were going pretty much all over the known world. And these are two pieces that were made for the Indonesian market, again around 1500. So an extraordinary span of trade was already in place, at least by the 16th century, if not earlier. Now, of course, the Europeans arrived in India in around, well, the first, as it were, official European presence in India was when the Portuguese arrived in 1498, when Vasco da Gama had discovered the sea route to India. and he landed at the port of Calicut in 1498. And the Portuguese more or less established themselves there very early on. And although the Portuguese market is not the subject of this talk, they started exporting Indian textiles to Portugal of a different kind, and we'll see in a moment. Now this gentleman, he's just a sort of generic Westerner from a bit later on, around 1600, 1610. We don't know quite who he is, but he's a sort of typical European, possibly English, possibly Portuguese trader perhaps in North India. Now obviously the Westerners were considered quite exotic and became a subject matter for painting and for pictorial textiles in their own right. And this picture, this textile was made probably for local use, not for export, although it's had a border put on around the edge of export, of later export chintz. And so these splendid fellows with their moustaches are probably Indian, but underneath we can see this scene here with some Europeans feasting at a table with these wonderful sort of glass vessels, and obviously the fact that a dog was allowed into the dining room was considered sufficiently unusual to be recorded. Carpets, of course, very important export from India as well as from Iran quite early on. And these are just two, I must apologize for the extremely bad picture of the top one. These are two Indian carpets that came to Britain in the 17th century, both still in London, the bottom one in the V&A. And this looks like a sort of normal, almost like a Persian carpet, except for the fact that in the border and in the field we get this English coat of arms from the Fremlin family. And as we'll see later on, coats of arms were something that were very important features of commissioned pieces in chintz as well as in carpets. Embroidery was, again, another very important export material. These are two details from the sort of wonderful embroideries that were sent from Eastern India, from Bengal, to Portugal from the 16th century onwards. Now, the Portuguese were thrown out of India in 1632, so that's quite a sort of useful cut-off date for when Portuguese export things stopped being produced. But these beautiful chain-stitch embroideries are typical of what was going there before they left. Now, but properly to look at some chintzes in more detail. The first type of chintzes that really took Britain by storm, if you like, were used as bed hangings. And this is the full-sized picture of the detail I showed on the very first image. Now, things like this were obviously based quite closely on English crewel work embroidery of the 17th century. So already by the, let me think now, the East India Company was founded in 1600, and very soon after that, by 1601, British ships had reached India and were looking to trade. They didn't yet know what they were going to be trading in, because the reason the East India Company was set up was in order to sell British goods in India. They didn't actually have, at that time, any idea that they might start importing Indian textiles, never mind what a colossal enterprise this was going to turn out to be. So in the early years of the 17th century, you start getting these letters back from India from the company officials saying what a terrible time they're having trying to sell their English woolen broadcloth and their mirrors in India. You know, we could have told them that. But they say, but there are some interesting textiles here which might sell in London. And so by 1618, Indian chintzes and embroideries are on sale in London. And by about 1640, designs are being sent out to India from England in order to tweak those Indian things to make them acceptable, palatable to English taste. And this is the sort of thing that was the result. Obviously, crewel work hangings were still very popular in Britain. On the left is a bed in a National Trust house in Devon, I think, Coat Heel. And you can see that this design of a sort of flowering tree coming out of, you can just see at the bottom here, there's this sort of rockery effect here. And this is the sort of thing on which the chintz on the right was based, and you can see this sort of rockery design at the bottom. So it wasn't the designs of the Indian chintzes to begin with that was the revolutionary thing. It was the material. These were made of cotton. Now, the crewel work embroidery were really quite thick. If you've ever seen any of them, you'll know that there was thick woolen chain stitch embroidery on quite heavy linen. Cotton was practically unknown in Europe at that time. Everything was either wool or linen, or if you were very rich, silk. So cotton was really a completely new thing. So the lightness of the material was new. The colours were completely new, and the fact that they were fast, that you could wash them, this was something that really revolutionised life in Britain in the early 17th century. Because the colours of the fabrics in Europe at that time were not really colour fast. Apart from the indigo equivalent, woad, there was very little that was fast that could withstand light and washing. So the lightness and brightness of the colours really sort of took England by storm, and basically they never went back to wool and linen in much of a way at all. Now, these same designs could be rendered also in embroidery, and this is a beautiful embroidered chain stitch embroidery from Gujarat, so from a completely different part of India. This is back up in the northwest, as opposed to the diagonally opposite end of India where the chintzes were coming from. So designs were obviously going to several parts of India where the East India Company was trading from. And just to try and give you a sort of sense of the difference between a crewel work embroidered hanging and an Indian silk chain stitch embroidered hanging, on the left is part of a very densely embroidered crewel work hanging, and on the right one of the beautiful chain stitch embroidered hangings from Gujarat. And again, the intensity of those colours is absolutely amazing. And this pinkish dye was probably actually done with lac dyeing, you know, the insect dye that is the equivalent of cochineal in America. The same sort of designs were done also in chintz, and again you can get some idea of the relative extreme increase in fineness and detail that you can get with one of the hand-drawn and resist-dyed chintzes. Now the hanging again that we saw first, we actually know which piece of crewel work embroidery it was based on. Sorry, it's only a black and white picture on the bottom, but this is the 17th century crewel work embroidery, of which there's a piece in Boston and there's a piece in Glasgow, and it's obviously the basis for the Indian chintz hanging above it. Now, some of the early chintzes didn't just conform to this crewel work type of hanging with the exotic flowers, and there are some very wonderful and quite extraordinary hangings from that early period. This one has obviously been made into a bed cover because it's got the corners taken out for the 4 posts, and in the centre is the Stuart coat of arms. Now, we don't know which Stuart king that was made for because it's such an unusual design, we can't date it by the design elements, but it's obviously a 17th century hanging. And here's a detail of it. And you can see that it's a sort of mixture of all sorts of Chinese and other elements, and I particularly like the pineapple. And I believe the pineapple was first introduced in Britain in 1640. So it's just possible that it could have been made even as a sort of celebration of the pineapple's arrival as well. Here's another wonderful chintz with sort of animal designs on, which is in Holland. And here, one of my favourites of all time is this marvellous, you can't probably see it very well on this overall view, but the central field is covered with, sort of fantastic creatures and animals in this central piece. But from the beginning of the 18th century onwards, trees really came to dominate. And I'll just show you a few of the different tree types. They started off very sort of large scale with these wonderful fanciful flowers. As I mentioned before, the Dutch were very fond of very large scale designs, and this again another immensely large palimpor is probably for the Dutch market, with this huge sort of monstrous tree and these wonderful great cornucopias at the bottom. The Dutch were also rather fond of pink or red backgrounds to their chintzes, and on the right is a sort of reconstruction of a Dutch interior of the early 18th century. And you can perhaps just see that on the left-hand wall is one of the woolen tapestries that was at the time being superseded by chintz hangings. So it was obviously possible that you could actually use both in the same room. And on the left is a part of a set of bed hangings probably made for the Dutch market, with this wonderful tree design. We've seen already the piece on the right, which again is another Dutch market non-tree design. But on the left is a piece probably made for the French taste. The French were very into rather sort of formal, rather architectural designs, often based on those of the royal designer Jean Bérin, who had been the chief designer at Versailles, for example. And so even though this was quite a few decades after his death, Bérin was still very influential, and these sort of rather classical strapwork designs were very popular in France. As the 18th century continued, the tree became more and more sort of Chinese in its flavour, partly because of the increased interest in chinoiserie that was sort of accelerating in Britain, where we get this mixture of Chinese and Indian elements. And you can see perhaps on the right that the tree has become much more sort of spiky and rather bamboo-like in its foliage. Now these would probably be used in a whole Chinese-themed bedroom. The wonderful style called Chinese Chippendale was around this time, when Thomas Chippendale was making these fantastic beds with sort of pagoda-like curved canopies and these amazing mirrors with Chinese people sitting on ledges. And all this would work very well with also the Chinese painted wallpaper that was coming in at the same time. So it's all taking on quite a strong Chinese element. And this is a detail of another Indian chintz, but has a very, very strongly Chinese type of design. Another very favourite type of design was one involving birds. And birds could be used in all sorts of different ways. This one, in fact, I'll show you a detail because you can't see them very well, but this is exquisitely painted, drawn and dyed. The detail is amazing and the colouring is unbelievably delicate and beautifully done. So birds were a very popular theme and continued to be so even when very, very stylised. As you can see on the piece on the left there, the birds have become sort of flattened almost into floral shapes to get into the design. Many of the tree designs were augmented by copies of European prints, and these were often of vases of flowers and these sort of urns and vases out of which the tree was growing. So these are just some details of the different types of bouquets of flowers that were often used, and these were often taken directly from French or Dutch still life paintings or prints. Cornucopia, another great favourite, often seen as well as the sort of tree design, and here's two different ways of treating them. One of the main, or a major element of many of the Western market chintzes was the personalised family crest or coat of arms that was incorporated into many of them. Now, these were often done sort of at the last minute, so you might have a chintz that's a very standard tree design or an all-over flower design with places left blank, and people would send in their orders to have their family coat of arms added. And I think this is what's happened on these two pieces, where you can see sort of heraldic devices added to an otherwise quite standard sort of chintz. Just a few more heraldic devices, again, where you can see what would have been just a sort of blank thing which has had coats of arms added, like in this corner detail here. And border designs, huge variation in borders. Let's just look at that last one. On the right, this amazing, very large-scale floral meander is very typical of a sort of Dutch type of border. And again, as the 18th century wore on, these became more and more elaborate. Some of them completely floral, or in the case of the one on the top, there's sort of some sort of root vegetable incorporated into the design. Again, the later part of the 18th century, you start getting these very Western type of swag details, which are obviously based on a sort of floral garland of various amounts of elaboration. Some of the chintzes were based very strongly on European silk, woven silk designs. Now, on the left is a dyed and painted chintz, which looks very much like a French silk of the 18th century. And on the right, this chintz dress length, again, is probably based on a bizarre silk, so-called, of the early 18th century. And again, on the right here is a repeat design, which again is probably a French woven silk pattern. On the left is a Dutch mourning gown, done very unusually, all in black. Again, obviously this is something that the Indian craftsman wouldn't have used normally at all, and would have been done as a special commission for this Dutch market. And dresses like this were particularly worn in the north of Holland, and indeed still are in one or two places on special occasions. Human figures as a design is an interesting area. Here you can see the flowering tree is there, as we would expect, but the bottom half is actually taken from an illustrated version of Don Quixote, and shows Don Quixote saying goodbye to Sancho Panza. And there are several of these extraordinary large palimpores that have a floral design combined with an image from an illustrated Western book. Again, Western people were obviously considered curious and exotic elements of design. Now, the puzzling thing about this is that it was obviously made as a petticoat for the Western market, and how a Western woman felt about wearing a petticoat that was decorated with Westerners who were obviously depicted in a sort of strange and exotic way. It's a sort of strange circular piece of circular sort of relationship. But here you can see the Westerners sort of taking tea and going out for a walk. Again, the inclusion of dogs is obviously something that was considered very odd by the Indian craftsmen. All of these little fragments, or this skirt, they all have Western figures as part of the design. Now, dress, as I mentioned, was something that started really as a sort of offshoot of the use of furnishing fabrics, and started by being made from those furnishing fabrics, and then became more and more popular in its own right, until even grand ladies like Madame de Pompadour in France would be seen wearing an Indian chintz dress. And here again, although her dress is rather a beautiful and delicate design, it's quite possible that it was originally a furnishing fabric, like the piece on the right, which is one of the large tree hangings. And another interesting thing about this picture is that it was completed in about 1764, which was the year of Madame de Pompadour's death. But in fact, the chintz looks as if it was quite a bit earlier in the 18th century than that. And we know that people would keep their chintzes going for years and years by converting them to the latest style, or even just by adding whatever sort of lace, frills and cuffs were in fashion at the time. And I think this is probably what Madame de Pompadour had been doing here with her wonderfully lavish lace cuffs. The other interesting thing about this picture is that it illustrates the way that chintz was seen as very much a sort of informal way of dressing, just as the chintz furnishings had been used for the minor bedrooms of a house. If you had a very fancy state bed where the king might be coming to stay, for example, you would be sure that it would still be decked out in velvet and silk. But the smaller rooms and the ladies' bedrooms and dressing rooms would often be furnished with chintz. And the same applied to dress. Chintz wasn't used for very formal dresses. That would still be silk. But Madame de Pompadour here is seen at her needlework, probably in the morning, and she's obviously in a very informal setting. And we find often that chintzes are used for very low-key, informal types of usage. As I mentioned, the large-scale furnishing fabric stopped being used for dresses as it became more and more popular. To begin with, dress of chintz had rather been looked down on because it was something that was obviously sort of second-hand. But by the end of the 18th century, we have wonderful quotations saying, the greatest ladies are now wearing chintz, where before it was only serving people. Some of the best collections of chintz now survive in Holland, and as these two dresses are. And that's partly because Holland never introduced prohibition on chintz, unlike Britain and France. Now, of course, the reason for this prohibition, which came in two phases in 1701 and 1720, was that it was so popular that the weavers of the local fabric, especially wool and linen, seriously feared for their livelihoods and were afraid that they would have no work whatsoever because people just weren't interested in wearing wool and linen anymore. And we know, for example, that in 1719 there was a great march of weavers from Spitalfield, the famous silk weaving centre in London, to Westminster, the seat of Parliament, to protest against the import of, not only the import of Indian chintz, but even British printing of Indian cloth. So all printed cotton was seen as basically the work of the devil. And there are amazing stories about how in 1619 the Spitalfields weavers would assault people wearing chintz dresses, would physically tear chintz clothes off people's backs. Really an extraordinary uprising, and something that we forget, that textiles can have this sort of extraordinary political power as well as a social one. So in Holland, where these two garments come from, nothing so dramatic ever happened, and they continued to wear chintz throughout the 18th century. That's why there's such fantastic collections there. On the right is a petticoat, and you can see the fact that there's no decoration on the top part of it, means that it was designed especially for that use, because it would be covered up with the jacket like the one on the left. So these were no longer things that were just lengths of cloth being made into garments. They were actually purpose designed for jackets and skirts. Oops, did I do that? Yes, I did. As I mentioned, men also were wearing these wonderful banyans, but again, very much as informal wear, and it was very much frowned upon if you actually went out in public in a banyan, unless you were in somewhere like Bath, where you would be expected to be going to the bath, and so you were expected to be in a certain amount of undress, and so it was okay to wear your banyan in the street. We have one wonderful source about the popularity of chintz in the 18th century, and this is something called Barbara Johnson's album. Barbara Johnson was an English lady, the daughter of a vicar in Bedford, I think, and she did an amazing thing, which was for 80 years she kept a sample of every fabric from which she ever had a dress made, as well as its price and so on. And so on the left, we have a page from her journal dated 1779. And here you can see an Indian chintz floral pattern on the right-hand side of the page, and a little tiny printed English fabric on the left. And it's interesting going through Barbara Johnson's album to see the arrival, if you like, of chintz into her life, how much she used it. But then by the end of the 18th century, we're starting to get English printed fabrics coming in very much as a rival to those Indian chintzes. And this is really the beginning of the end for the Indian chintz trade. As the 18th century wore on and Indian chintzes started to come back after Prohibition was lifted in 1774, this is just the sort of time when printing technology was really increasing and improving in England. Of course, this was the Industrial Revolution. And the reason that the Industrial Revolution was taking place was largely in order to make textiles that could compete with the Indian imports. And this was really the end of the story for Indian chintz. And European printed textiles started to take their place. These were done by roller printing, so huge quantities of cloth could be printed in a very short time. And this sort of thing was particularly expertly developed in France, and in particular in Alsace. And like, for example, the piece on the left is a roller printed cotton from Alsace, compared to, on the right, an earlier Indian chintz. And this is really, as I say, the end of the line for Indian chintzes, just as with several other types of Indian imports which were successfully destroyed, if you like, by the Western imitations made by mechanized means. So the beautiful hand-painted and hand-dyed Indian chintzes succumbed to the Western imitations. So I think that's where I'll wrap up. Thank you.